Got the camera updating, video is working. Looks good.
They're doing good. I told you I'm what do you call it? Fermenting them. They're like just about done. Just hot sauce. Hot sauce. Oh, spoilers. Okay. Little stream problems, but we are good to go now. Hey guys. Hey Victoria, just let me know if you guys can hear me. Sorry about that. It was a little... I had to get it properly set up on this end, but hopefully it's all good for you guys now. Thanks, Caitlin. So it's been a little bit. I mean, I've been seeing you guys, but last time I lectured for you was like week 1 or something. Look how far you've came. Building web applications. You're making the next rival to Twitter. It seems like it's going good for you guys, and I hope it's going good over in Victoria as well. So this is the week of the front end, and you guys have seen kind of some CSS stuff, some front end JavaScript, and we're going to kind of continue along that vein of front end JavaScript and focus on this kind of interesting technology called Ajax. Us in the web development community, not notoriously well known for our naming conventions. And we kind of hit it out of the park again with this one, with Ajax, not the greatest name. We'll see it stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And if that makes no sense, I mean, I'm almost right along with you at that point. But we'll look at what that means. The first half of this, we're kind of going to dive into the fire by example and build out a bit of a demo to see what Ajax provides for us and how it works. And then second half to a third, we're going to kind of just explore more conceptually Ajax and also think of some developer tips around how you guys are going to be using it. So topics we're going to hit, we're going to look at the browser and Ajax, just kind of a general what is the use case for this technology. We're going to look at fallbacks, the responses and cores. We'll dive into this obviously more. But first off, what is Ajax? It's not this guy, but let's get this a little bigger. So it stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, like we talked about. What this actually means in like a more realistic description, it allows us to send and receive data from a server asynchronously. And then if we even take it down a notch from there, it means that we can change content dynamically without reloading the page. So far, when we want to get, we have our, I don't know, like compass or something, and we want to get new content. Oh, this is my, let's look up So if I want to view, let's make sure this is a nice, wholesome content. So I want to view this page. Can anyone notice the difference between how how Reddit handles when I click on this link compared to how maybe you handled updating data with something like TinyApp? When you wanted to switch between the general view, seeing all of your links, going into the edit page, what happened between both of those pages of UI? What were the steps that you guys had to do? Because you made it. What was the transition between like your home page and like an edit screen on TinyApp? Yeah. It redirected you to a different page. Exactly. And so what's happening behind the scenes there? What makes up a redirect to another page? A GET request. And a GET request is an HTTP request. And part of how we did an HTTP request, we did a GET request to slash maybe short URL slash edit or something. It went back to our server side. Our server checked all of its route until it found a match. It maybe did some back-end computing, but then it re-delivered an EJS page or like a template page to our front end. And then our front end, once receiving that, reloaded the page and displays all of the content according to how we wanted it. If you look at here, when I click on this link, it's maybe kind of hard to see, but we're not getting a page refresh. We're just getting, content changing based on a click. If I click on the subreddit, the whole page and UI changes, but we're not seeing, up here where we normally see that the page is reloading. We're not seeing any response like that. If I do it back, I don't know if we got again, hitting this, we don't have any refresh. Whereas if I go to something like Wikipedia maybe, when I hit on feature content, we saw that quick current events. The page is doing something similar to what TinyApp was doing. It's doing a GET request, and when it receives that new content, it's refreshing the page to render the new content to the screen. So that subtle difference that we're seeing between maybe Wikipedia and Reddit is what we're going to be looking at today. Wikipedia does its HTTP requests the traditional way that we've been using up to this point. Reddit is using this great name of a thing, Ajax. And we saw that, don't betray me. There we go. We saw that this is changing the content dynamically without reloading the page. So when we go to like even the home page, we get a whole new set of dynamic content, but we're not getting that refresh. And this has a lot of benefits that we're going to see down the line. It also has some maybe cons hidden in there that we'll also explore. But that's the kind of summary behind what it's going to do for us. Technology-wise, behind the scenes, Ajax is a combination of a browser XML HTTP request object and client-side JavaScript and HTML. This XML HTTP request object is something that is supported or provided by all modern browsers for the most part. We don't have to directly interact with this. In our example, we're going to be kind of abstracted a step back by looking at Ajax request with jQuery. But behind the scenes, this request object is what will be allowing us to do these requests without having to reload the page. Yeah. Let's see, Victoria. Let me know if it unfreezes for you guys. I might have to kill it and start it again if it's not working, or maybe you can't even hear me. It is frozen. Is the audio coming through at all? We're back. Okay. Yeah, keep me updated on the stream. I don't want to drop you guys. That would be unfortunate. Yeah, I'll try and keep a close eye on Slack. I'll actually turn my volume up so I can hear the pings. Caitlin. There usually is a little bit of a delay between these streams. I'll just make sure to, if I'm asking for questions or updating you guys, make sure I'm waiting the appropriate amount. But we were saying that, yeah, in simplest terms, the difference between Ajax and not Ajax is us being able to do this versus this. Maybe quickly before we jump into, Wikipedia, always want my donation. Before we jump into it, maybe we can do a quick summary of what we all remember from HTTP requests. Because as we're jumping into Ajax, it's nothing different from an HTTP request. It's just a different way of initiating it. So what makes up a HTTP request? So I'm going to do that as part of a method. There's a bunch of methods that make up a HTTP request, one of them being post. What was your comment? Listen? So the server has to listen. What else? Okay. Wait, you said hashing? Action. Oh, okay, yeah. Actions. I don't know, Victoria, you guys had any other thoughts? What else? Callback. So this is how we handle HTTP requests for the most part when we're working with JavaScript. Status code. So these are like the main points we're all hitting. An HTTP request happens over a network. One last thing I'm going to add is that it's a part of being sent over a network. It involves a protocol. HTTP request is part of the HTTP protocol, and it's built on top of other network protocols. We don't have to think too much about those other network protocols, just knowing that they exist there. So going forward, thinking of this new horizon of how we can use HTTP requests, none of this stuff here is really going to change. It's all the same. We're just given a new way to do an HTTP request. So instead of kind of jumping or getting too theoretical about it or conceptual, let's practically just see how we can use Ajax in the real world. So we're going to start a project. I'm just going to make a new folder here. I'm going to call it code. And I'm going to make a couple new files. We're going to have an index HTML file. We're going to have a app.js file. This is just for our client-side JavaScript. And we're also going to have a style.css file. So we'll get a basic skeleton going. And we want to script source our app file. And we also want to link in our style.css file. And lastly, because we briefly said in the start that we're going to be using jQuery to do our Ajax requests, what do we need to do in order to use jQuery within our project? Yeah, we also have to link it in. And I have a couple options for how I could link it in. I could download the whole jQuery file and include it in my local project. I could also use a CDN. So if you're ever using an external JavaScript library, you can always look at the name of the library and type in CDN. And you'll often be pointed towards sites like these that give you links to include the file, essentially. In our case, it's a little library from a remote server. So I'm going to use the minified version, and it gives me right here kind of the script tag that I can use to include in my project. Lastly, before we go on, have you guys thought about, or has anyone talked to you about where is the best place to include our script tags or scripts in our HTML file? Or even why it would make a difference where I included them? After the body? Okay, why would we want to include it after the body? Because it works better that way. Yeah. So one reason is when our browser is loading this HTML page, it's going to go top to bottom, like we've seen with most of our programming stuff. And when it hits one of these script tags, it's going to take the time to load in that script and then run it. If we have a bunch of big scripts at the very start of our page, when the user goes to get to our page and they hit here, if those scripts are big, they'll see a noticeable kind of delay before the content gets rendered, because that's the script loading and then running before it even shows the things. So one kind of trick to handling that is to take your scripts and put it underneath the body. Then you're saying, okay, load all of the HTML content, the body and everything, and then load my scripts. So the user will always get content displayed before these things run. And that works and is a totally appropriate way of doing it. I'm going to show you one other way of kind of handling that same problem, and that is with a few keywords that we can use. So the first one is defer. Defer kind of does exactly what putting these script tags at the bottom of the body does. It's saying when you hit this script, don't load or run this file until the whole file loads, and then you can begin. So you're deferring the execution of this script until the end. The other option is async, and that means asynchronously or at the same time I want you to load this script file as it's loading the other assets of the page, so the HTML, images, whatever static contents might be in the page. And then only once your app.js or whatever script that you're loading in is finished, then you can execute it. So async could potentially execute before the page completely renders all of the HTML and stuff, depending on how long it takes to load. We're just going to use defer because all of our scripts are going to be stuff that we only want running once that HTML is there anyways. All right, so we have a kind of skeleton for maybe a basic app, but we don't really have an idea of what we're building yet. And my thought for what we could build is one of these guys. So there's a pretty good API for all things Pokemon. And our goal is to have a Pokédex kind of application that we can search different Pokemon and have it dynamically make fetches to this API and update the content kind of live to us without having a refresh or a delay in rendering. We don't want to have to, every time we look at a new Pokemon, have our UI break and then come back and and be slower. We want like kind of fast, instant Pokemons. So just looking at, we'll look in the documentation. There is a basic route. So, why is it? No. There's a lot of stuff. So there's like berries, contests, encounters, evolutions, games. We just want to focus on the Pokemon. So the API, this is giving us the abilities. I know it shows it on the home page. So the API is this, their Pokemon API, and if we do Pokemon slash either a Pokemon's name or a number, it'll give us this set of information on that Pokemon. So someone, I don't know, who has a number between 1 and like a million these days? 88. So if we go Pokemon slash 88, we get Grimer. And we get Grimer's abilities, like too much stuff, I guess. Abilities, forms, items, moves, sprites. So this is something we'll probably want. Sprites are just the image for what this guy looks like. If I copy this in here, this little sprite of Grimer. You don't like that guy. And then we also have a name and an ID, which is helpful. So we can kind of check any Pokemon by number. We can also check Pokemon by name, and it'll give us the resource back. What are the things that we would want to like have the Pokedex show? So we have an image, we have a name. The other thing I was thinking we could do is like a description. And just in briefly checking through this API, description is not something they have for this API endpoint, Pokemon slash whatever. But they have another endpoint called characteristic. And this, you would slash whatever the Pokemon's ID is. So Bulbasaur, he's got a description, he loves to eat. So just in our initial planning, we kind of have 2 API endpoints that we're going to want to hit in order to populate our kind of basic Pokédex implementation. We want that image, we want that name, and we want the description. Because this is like front-end week, I thought we're not going to go into detail on how we're going to build this out CSS and HTML-wise, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of like go through it maybe somewhat fast, but instead of like me having just like a template built, we can kind of build it out. So I'm going to create a div. I'm going to give it the class called Pokédex. And then inside that div, I'm just going to do like a title at the top, Pokédex, followed by an image. And this image will just be, if there is a Pokemon, it'll show it. I'm going to give this an ID of just image so we can grab it later from our client-side JavaScript. And then for now, the source can just be, we said we didn't like Grimer, so we'll, too bad. We'll make it Grimer for now. And then that should be good for the image. Next, underneath, we'll do just like a H2, so a bit smaller than an H1, and this will be our name. So I'm just going to give it question marks. And again, an ID, so we can grab this later for name. And then finally, just a paragraph tag, and this will be our description, which is nothing right now, but we'll also give an ID so we can dynamically grab it, and we'll call it description. So maybe our first task is just to have this dynamically load in some Pokemon's image information from the API. And then eventually we're probably going to want to come back up here, add in like an input so that as users we can type in either a name or a number and have it dynamically populate whatever we typed in. But for now we'll keep it simple like this. We'll pop into style. So just a refresher, we have a div, our holding div, which is Pokédex. Then we have a title, an image, another title, and then a paragraph. So Pokédex, we'll give this like a max. We'll give it a width of 50%. I'm going to go margin left auto and margin right auto, so it's in the center. Background color, and let's just get a color picker. So, oh, look, it's right here. We'll grab that red, and I'm going to do a border radius of 20 pixels maybe, just so it has nice curved corners. And then the padding, we'll also do 20 pixels. And we will do display flex. But our flex direction is going to be column. If we want to see this, what I'm going to use to run our application is something called HTTP-server. It's just a super lightweight server that runs in whatever folder that I run it, and it delivers statically the files that are in there. So I have 3 files: index, app, and style, and it can just, from, let's see, port 8081, it'll be able to reach those files. And by default, it's going to serve index.html, because I don't really want to spend a bunch of time building a lightweight Express server. You guys have seen that already. It is a npm module, so I just did npm install, and I did it globally -g http-server, and I can just run it really quickly in any folder. It's really nice for just getting like kind of quick prototyping. Oh yeah, so we got our guy. He's super distorted, so we'll pop back over here. Just gonna do this. And next we wanted to do. Obviously, the image needs a little bit of work. We'll have the width, which it already is doing, just be 100% kind of. But the height will do auto. That means that it will be proportionate to whatever width we set it, so it won't get distorted in any way. I'm also going to do a background color, and so that it's not just transparent against the red background. We can kind of do like a screen type of thing. So maybe like a light green type of color. That might be okay. What is... We'll use our handy dandy inspector to see if our styles are being applied, and obviously they are not. No, IMG should be good. Pokédex image. Any thoughts? Oh, Maybe my server was just too slow. So we get that. Let's throw some nice round corners in there. Like Lazy Man's nice design. Nice. We could do more, but maybe we'll just leave it at that for now. Ooh, it is pretty big. Let's do a max width of 400 pixels. So it'll grow to 50% until it hits 400 pixels. Is this? Maybe 400 pixels is too big. Or maybe it's just not loading again. It's okay. Well, we won't be too picky about our Pokedex's look. So right now we just have the static image, a static name, and a static description. We want to get this stuff from our API. So this is the root of the API we want to use. I'm just going to copy that. We'll head over into app. We're using jQuery, so we have our handy dandy $sign. Because all of the script that we're going to be writing will be dependent on the content of the page, we want to be updating this already existing image, this already existing name, and this already existing title. I'm going to do a document ready to make sure that that stuff actually exists before I try and do anything to it. I'm going to make a constant called path that will just be the root of our API, so we don't have to repeat that throughout our stuff. And then the first place we can stop is let's make a function. We'll call it getPokemon. It'll take one parameter, our search parameter. And I was hoping that we could do like a flexible search, either a number or a name, because the API we're using takes a number or a name, so we can kind of just plug in either, and it should work for us. Yeah, so normally, if we wanted to do this with our old-fashioned HTTP requests, this index page would probably be on a get route to /index. We would do that API call on the back end, and then we would just serve it to the front end, like as template bars or something. Right now, we have the index page, and it doesn't have any information. So we want to do an HTTP request from the client side, and we just want to get the information and have nothing else happen. So with jQuery, you can do Ajax. Like Ajax is not something specific to jQuery. You can do it in vanilla JavaScript. It is easier with jQuery. So and you guys have been using jQuery as a front-end library, so we're going to stick with that. The method is .ajax, and it takes a number of parameters, many of them optional. The main one that we have to think about is URL, and that's just where we're making this Ajax request to. By default, the Ajax request is going to be a GET request, but we can override that and say method post. But we're just getting information from the API, so we don't need a post or anything. We're fine with the default GET method. I'm going to use template literal string, and I'm going to say whatever the root path is, I'm going to go to that. It includes the slash, so I don't need a slash here. But then I'm going to go to Pokemon slash, and this is the variable part that we need to get from the user. So this will be our search string, essentially. And that is kind of all we need for a asynchronous JavaScript request. Of course, doing this, the request will happen. I mean, we can save this, and if we've set up this file correctly, I can look over here in the network tab. Oh, of course, we're not calling our function. So we need to do get poke. We'll 25. I'm not super stoked on how slow our server is in updating stuff at this point. I'm just going to do a console log of the search itself to make sure that we don't have another error in our code. And the fact that we are not getting it means I'm going to restart our server. Yeah, what were you saying? We can look. What was the typo that? Oh, yeah. Nice catch. The other catch is that if we're wanting to use JavaScript or jQuery, we need to include our app.js after the fact. So I just moved it down one. So maybe I was blaming the server. Probably it was not the server's fault. Sorry, server. And if we come down here, I don't know if you guys have played around with the network tab very much, but it can be very handy. There's all these options across the top. XHR, JavaScript, CSS, image, media, font, all of these things that our front-end application might be loading in. So we can see what images are we getting. And we just see this dude. What CSS files are we getting? The one that's important to us when we're thinking of Ajax or asynchronous JavaScript requests is XHR. We'll look in a little bit later what this is, but XHR is that object that jQuery or any Ajax request uses to make the asynchronous request. And in the XHR thing, we see something called 25. If we look at it, it's a request to the Pokey API with the method get. The status was 200, meaning our request was successful. There's a bunch of stuff on the headers, but if we pop over to the response, we can see that there's a bunch of JSON data that we got back from this server. And this happens after we initially load the page, so it's asynchronous. It's useless right now because it's not doing anything, but we are getting it back. So pop into this network tab when you start making these requests. You can kind of see when they start, what the response is. If this had failed, it would have given us a different status code, maybe some information on what we could do to fix it. But this is a good first check. If it's not showing up here, your request, then you've probably not created it properly. There's also this timeline at the top where you can see like when stuff is happening on the page load. So if I just highlight over here, maybe if I show all, it'll be more impressive. So if I highlight here, this is the initial page load, and then after the page loads, then we're getting the Ajax request, this number 25. So back to our script. We're getting the data, but we're not actually using it. And because this is an asynchronous request, it takes some time. We need to handle it with our asynchronous kind of handling techniques. The one we're going to use here is then, because this function as it is will return a promise, and we will catch it with then. We'll get the response that it is returning. And then we could do some things with it here. We could just console log it. And we should be able to see in our console the nice big array of stuff that it gets back. But what we're going to want to do is we're going to look through this information and update this to our little Pokedex here. So the things that were important to us were name, which is just a key value pair in the root of this object that was returned. Sprites, which looks like an object with a bunch of key value pairs on which type of sprite we want. And those are the only two things we can get from this first one. Remember, our API call to /Pokemon doesn't have the description. So we'll just start with what we have. I'm going to create a little object, and then we'll update it as we receive information from our different Ajax calls. So Pokemon dot name is going to equal our response dot name, and then Pokemon dot image is going to equal, and this is where we'll have to look back. It's going to be in sprites, and then we're probably going to want to get the front default. So res.sprites.front default. And after this, we don't just want this information, we want to actually update our UI. So I'm going to create a new function called maybe update Pokédex, and we'll have it take in one Pokemon object. And because we've built up this one here to have a name, image, and then eventually description, that's what we will assume will be used here. And we can grab the different tags in our DOM and set the contents accordingly. So the first thing we'll grab is the name, which has an ID of handily name. And then we'll do text, and we will set that to Pokemon.name. We can then go similarly description, even though we don't have real support for that yet. And then lastly, we want to get the image, and that's a little bit different because we don't want to set the text of the image, we want to set the source attribute. And with jQuery, we have a function called attribute, and then we specify which attribute we want to set, so the source, and we want to set it to the image. Let's put some default values in our Pokemon object. So name, if we can't find the name, its default value will remain question marks. The description will still be unknown, and the image will be, let's find is no, this guy. And this, it's super appropriate because in the red and blue version where this Pokemon would come up, it was literally a programming error where they were searching for the Pokemon by ID, and they searched outside of the range of 151 Pokemon, and so it kind of just caused a bug in the way they would load it. But that's why you would see the missing number text. Cool.
Why did you write image instead of IMG?
Oh yeah. So the question is, why did I use image instead of IMG? I could have done either, but this is just my key for storing the data. It's not directly related to the tag or anything. It's just so I can access it here. Okay, and hopefully we should see something. Maybe errors, but maybe not. And we didn't use update Pokédex, so nothing happened actually. Once we get the return, we're going to do an update Pokédex, and we're going to pass it in that Pokemon object. Try one more time. Whoa. So even though it's just happening on the initial load, it still is dynamic because it's like we can come in here to our thing. We'll see what 12 is. And we get kind of a dynamic loading thing. Before we jump into the next step of trying to get like a nice input so we can decide which ones we're seeing, let's look back at our process so far. And I'm going to kind of walk through step by step, but try and think of any questions that you have so we can really get this part handled. The new stuff, or the Ajax stuff, is kind of confined to here. And all we're doing is we're defining some parameters for an HTTP request, and the parameters are similar to the parameters that we would have provided for other HTTP requests. We need to know the method, we need to know the path, we could optionally add some like headers and things like that. We're waiting for the response, and then based on the data we get back from that HTTP request, we're updating the DOM. So it's the same cycle. You know, we have a request and then a response coming back. We have the same parameters in our request, and in the response, you know, we can kind of do with it as we will. Yeah. Any questions at this point on our small Ajax request?
Can you talk about how when you have like Pokemon.name, how it like overrides the default name?
Okay, cool. So the question was, I have kind of a default name here to a question mark, but then down here I'm essentially overriding it to be something else. So when we have an object and we have our, you know, like key value pairs, the one thing about this object, or like it's kind of, you can think of it as a library, is the keys are unique. You can't set more than one thing in the object with the same key. So by down here doing .name and setting it to something new, I'm just overriding. There's only one box in my object labeled name. I'm just opening that box, tossing whatever is in it currently, and putting something new inside. Yeah, and if I don't, so my thinking behind that was, if this request fails, then will not be triggered, and instead we'll have a fail triggered down here, which we don't have any error handling right now. But I could still do something here. Like I could still go update Pokédex maybe, and we'll just have it be updated to be these values, question mark, unknown, and that guy. One weird thing about promises with jQuery is, for some reason, they like to use .fail for their promise failure catching. With like normal JavaScript promises, you see a .then, and what was the other one? .catch. This, to be honest, just like super frustrates me. I have no idea why you'd be like, oh, the standard is .catch, but we like .fail. So that's a small thing. But yeah. Any other questions? Any thoughts in Victoria? I'll wait a couple minutes in case you guys are still on that delay. But does it seem kind of good so far? The one thing about Ajax is that it's like a super cool technology because it lets us do really awesome stuff like dynamically generate content. But it's actually not that foreign because we've seen HTTP requests. We've done this a lot of times up to this point. It's just like taking something like an old friend and using it in a new way. Cool. So the next thing we want to do is check, or I guess do a second request to get the description. Well, actually, maybe the next thing we'll do will be to put that input form here, because that's a little more, we can really like demonstrate the asynchronous requestiness of this program if we get that input form. So we'll go back to our Pokédex. I'm going to put in a form. I'm going to put in a input type text input, and then we'll have another input, and this will be of type submit. And we'll give these something to identify them by. So our form will be maybe, this will be our find form, and our input will be our search. Let's just check out how it looks to start a little form here. And our hope is that we type in some number here and hit submit, and we'll get, you know, the thing coming up. What happens right now when I do it? When I hit submit, we see it's very fast because it's a local server and it's not loading any assets. But if you look closely here, yeah, we get a refresh. And that's because, I mean, we know this. By default, when we have a form in HTML and we submit that form, it triggers a normal HTTP request. So if we don't want to do a normal HTTP request, but we want to do it in this new Ajax way, an asynchronous request, we have to do something to kind of say like, hey, don't do that. We'll handle it from here. So what we can do over in our script is we can grab that form. We can grab the find form, and we can add a listener for the submit event. And when it's submitted, we want to do some things. So this submit event takes a callback, and that callback has one parameter being the event that's fired on that submit, similar to other kind of like DOM events that you might have been seeing up to this point. With this event in particular, we have a function that we can do called prevent default. And what this will do is it's going to prevent the default action that happens when a form is submitted. In this case, the default action is for that HTTP request to go forward. So now if we refresh this and run the same thing, just nothing happens, which is good in our case because at this point we don't want the HTTP request. We want to do that ourselves. So we just let kind of like nothing happen. And instead of doing absolutely nothing, we're going to we'll get the search stuff that they put in just with a jQuery search we gave, and we'll get the value from it. And then we'll use our already existing function, which makes that asynchronous request, to kind of update our UI. So we'll go get Pokemon search. And hopefully, this just works as expected, because we've kind of done it once, first one. So any other number suggestions? 15? Go to 15, and nice. Let's do like a big one, like 321. The famous Pokemon Wailord, everyone.
What's Snorlax?
We can also hopefully go this though. So the API does take both numbers and names. So hopefully our thing will also. Yay! This is a cute Snorlax sprite. Cool. So essentially, we're overriding the default of the form, and we're saying, no, do our stuff instead. We'll make the Ajax request. And as we kind of toggle through these different numbers, our page is not refreshing. But if we look to our network tab, we see all these. Maybe we'll just filter that. We see all these small little requests that are happening to that API endpoint. A 600 number. Here, let's see what the number of the beast Pokemon is. Get that out of here. Oh, this guy's cool. Gulurk. Cool. So the next thing we'll kind of do to maybe wrap up the basic features of our thing is we want to do a second asynchronous call to get the additional information of these guys' like description. But before we do that, we're gonna take a break. Oh sweet. Hey Victoria. Hey, I got a feeling that you're not supposed to add IDs. Sorry, that is totally true and something I was going to talk about. So yeah, you want to be sparse in your ID usage. And if we look at my HTML thing, I kind of have not been. I've been throwing like find, search, submit, image, name, description. One thing that you guys, I'm sure, saw with an ID is that it has to be unique to a single HTML or DOM element. So I cannot do a separate form where I have any of these IDs. In this case, this is like a singular thing. I know I'm only ever going to have one form. I'm not going to create like multiple of these. So I just wanted a fast way to like not focus on finding this DOM element, but to grab it. So I opted for using IDs. If we were doing this in, it's a little bit of a toss-up here, again, because if I only have one of these and I just want to make sure that I am updating specifically this piece of UI, it's kind of okay. In terms of like CSS, that's where we really want to be careful with using too many IDs. In my styling here, I'm using Pokedex and then Pokedex image. And the reason we want to be light-handed with IDs in terms of CSS is because how strong they are in specificity. So specificity, again, is what decides the war between different styles. So if I tell this paragraph tag that I want it to be blue, and then in another style somewhere else I tell it that it should be red, how does it decide that it's going to be blue or red? That's how specific my selectors are. So these are the selectors for my CSS. If I'm using IDs everywhere, they're very powerful, and it kind of becomes like, it can be messy in applying the correct styles everywhere. Because then if I find that I'm trying to change that paragraph to blue when somewhere else it's red, and I use the ID to change it red, now I have to somehow come up with a more powerful selector than an ID. So you get in this kind of arms race of stronger and stronger selectors. So no, super good point, Caitlin. Definitely we should be cautious on using IDs, especially with CSS stuff. My motivation behind using it here was I only have very specific pieces of UI that I want to update. But during the break, I can show you a quick, well, like I'll quickly refactor it and show you an alternative when you come back, and we can kind of look at that. But yeah, I'll give you guys 10 minutes, and we'll come back at 11:14. If you think of any questions during that break, we'll start with questions when we come back. No joke, last night we brought up the trailer. Me and Tina watched it, and then we watched Family Guy. No, we didn't watch it. We were both like, oh, this looks super cool. But you know when you're like super like fried, like just tired, and like a good show is almost like too much. You're like, oh, this, I don't want to like miss stuff. So I'm going to though, man. Yeah. You know, the last day, I'm like, I watched the first episode. I should change the default name. Ah! No, I didn't shampoo my hair this morning.
Wait, actually?
What's your? Oh, yours are on the. What's next?
I've settled to react to the component. I go router, component libraries, bring in a map, and if
Oh, cool.
yeah.
It's a pretty cool one. Yeah, I had Game Boy, like the first one. I had my first Game Boy was a Game Boy Mini. I think so. There was Game Boy, and then there was Game Boy Color and Game Boy Mini came out like around the same time. Just Game Boy. I think it was. Yeah, that was the Mini. I think. I think it was called Mini. Whatever that one was, that's the one I had. I had the see-through one. Yeah. Yeah. So you could see the stuff inside. Yeah. Oh yeah. I had red and I had yellow. Yeah. 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 You play the game.
Like afterwards.
I remember like the like kind of neighborhood I lived in. I had a couple friends on like kind of parallel streets, and we would all like run and just like meet up together in the streets and just like sit on like the sidewalk and just like play Pokemon and like the Game Link thing, like trade. It's just like such a funny, yeah, like time. Yeah, I always think like that age range, like late element, well, even like all of elementary school, it's like such an interesting, so like a, almost like tribal or like trends just like explode like wildfire. Like just something comes out and everyone's like so into it. Yeah, just everyone's like, yeah. It's so true. Yeah. What was another? Come on, was a huge. Yeah. I remember like everyone at our school at one point got into marbles for some reason. They're like, we did the Beyblades and the new school stuff. We're gonna kick it old school and go back to the marbles. Um, yeah, just a bunch of stuff. No, or not even like action figures in general like that much. Like I don't remember anyone playing. Yeah. Yeah. Friends who were into Beanie Babies. Yeah. I don't think like ever. It's definitely the biggest thing.
It's when it started happening.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're like,
Like every $5 I got, I went straight to the game shop and bought a deck. Like every
11
yeah,
whatever.
just
Card.
almost child gambling.
Yeah. There was always
Yeah, it was a cutthroat.
like stock market for kids.
Yeah. Oh. And then everyone was like, "Yeah, keep these, and I'll be rich later because they'll be worth so much."
You know,
Yeah.
they
Really? I
Yeah,
thought I look if you, but just cards though are pretty much like
you get
they're like worthless. Only if it's like first edition print. If it's like third or fourth, like people don't even care about it. Yeah. Yeah, I remember those. If you want to spend $1,000. Okay, we're gonna start back up. Victoria, just let me know when you've joined us. And I said we'd start with questions. So if anyone has any questions on stuff we've gone over at this point, we can jump into it. So the question was, what is the difference between sending a request this way with Ajax versus the Fetch API? And both are Ajax actually. So the Fetch API is just a newer browser-supported way of doing an asynchronous JavaScript and XML request. It's just not as on the nose named as jQuery's Ajax request. So yeah, we're going to look at a few kind of variants of how this Ajax pattern might show up, but Fetch is one of them. So that's an awesome point. Victoria, if you had any questions, just throw them up. I did want to address the ID thing. So I changed all of these things to class. Like all of the IDs, I just did a kind of select all and change them to classes. And then over here in our app, I just do the dot instead of the pound or the number sign or hashtag, and it still works. So there's no reason. The one area where I generally am like for using the ID is right here where we have this input. So I gave it now a class of search, but what happens if I copy this, and give it, so we have two inputs now with the class search. If I refresh, if I save and refresh, we got these two input boxes. If I just like put in two numbers, what? So it works. The reason I thought it wouldn't work is over here in our app.js, we're going get search and get the value. And because we have two input boxes, we have two values. So this code now becomes a little bit ambiguous as to which value we're getting. My assumption is that it would give us just an array of values, but it seems like it's probably just getting the first value from there, which actually isn't a horrible thing because it doesn't break it. But when I want to know that I'm only getting, say, the value from a single thing, this is where I would make this one ID. and so that my HTML will break if I use a second ID of search somewhere. So it just won't let me have a silent error where I'm using two classes of search and then kind of getting it to respond not in the way that I thought. The other thing with doing all of these classes and then having jQuery update them by class is I need to be very careful that like these class names to me are too generic for what I'm doing. I would make these class names a little bit more specific so that I don't, in some other place in my application, use a class called image, name, or description or any of these and just have it be updated by the stuff that I'm doing here. Yeah, so we left off wanting to get our description, and the API for that was to do /characteristic/ID. And I believe here, yeah, we actually do need to use the ID. So we have to be a little bit more discerning on how we get that information. Over here in our app where we've done our first Ajax call, we're going to want to do a second Ajax call after we get the first set of information, because we need to use that information to get the ID to make our second call to characteristic singular. And here we don't want to use the search. We want to do the res.id. So one way of doing this would then just to be to go then get the kind of second response and do a bunch of things. Besides that stuff's now in the wrong place and things, why would this not be the greatest pattern to do if I wanted to do two successive, in our case, HTTP requests, or two successive asynchronous things? There's a word that might become more obvious if I start doing, no, what happens if I want to do a third? And what happens then if I want to do a fourth? Yeah, we're getting into callback, well, what looks like callback hell, even though we're using promises. So just because we're using promises doesn't mean we can just avoid naturally like this super nested kind of callbacky hell situation. We're still there. It still haunts us. But what we can do instead is when we have a promise, we can chain promises. I don't know if that's something you've seen at this point, but what I mean by that is I can go then and I can get kind of the past or the like continuation of this promise chain. Whatever I return from this then will be picked up in the following then. So if I return 5 here, continue will be 5, and I can continue working on it. But a more helpful pattern is to return this promise, and then will only be triggered when this promise finishes, and it will be the result of that promise, which will be our like our second response. And therefore, we kind of avoid callback hell, and we keep it linearly. It'll still get a little bit messy if we have like 5 promises, but we're not getting that indented thing happening. We're going to move our update Pokédex down into the second then, so that before we run it, we can go Pokemon.description equals, and this is where we'll pop over here, and we'll check out. So it has a base key called descriptions, and inside descriptions is an array of objects, and each of those objects has a description and a language. So we might have to deal with languages, but to me that says we can go second res.descriptions, which was an array of objects. We can get one of those. So say we do the first one, and then we will get from that, which is an object, one of these looking objects, we'll get the description. and then we'll update. We don't need this anymore. Yeah. Now let's give it a try. So we got our description, but it is in the wrong language. Same if we go Pikachu. Oh, what? Did I spell it wrong? Let's look at our network. We're trying to do a request to undefined. Oh, is this? Why would this be? Did I not switch this over? So I didn't switch. There we go. So we should be able to do and also get another description, but it looks like it's in this French. So what we'll do is instead of getting the first description, we'll get the last description. And there's a couple ways we could do this. The way I'm going to do is just get the length and then -1. That's not it. Alert to sounds. Wow. So now we can put in, like a number, and we can get the name, the description, and the image. We kind of have rounding out the features that we wanted. Problem though, as I discovered looking at this API yesterday, was it's just not up to date at all for this endpoint. So if we put in anything over 30, we just get null. So it's up to 30, and then they just haven't updated it past then. So that's super annoying. So with ours, if we do 45, we don't get that description. But we were smart enough that when we made it, we had our default description. So it doesn't break. It still just runs. And the pattern that it's going in the case where we can't find a description and our request that we see here in our network tab is 404, like not found. We hit the first promise, or sorry, we hit the first request. Its promise is successful because it's a real Pokemon. We set the name and the sprite, and then we start the second promise, which fails because it's, they haven't updated it. So we don't get the successful part of our then run. We just jump straight to the fail, and we just do an update Pokédex without ever having updated the description. So not the worst thing, but still a little bit frustrating. Cool. I think there's a couple things we can add on to this if we have some time. They're less Ajax-y stuff, but it would be fun nonetheless. But that's only if we have extra time, because we're going to jump in and just look at some more details on Ajax, and we'll kind of jump in to the technology itself and see if we have any more specific questions on Ajax itself as opposed to just practically how it's used. So the first thing we're going to look at is,
in your Ajax, you have to specify like the method of like whether it's a get or post.
yeah, so we briefly looked at here in our call. When I use .ajax, the default is get, but of course that's not the only HTTP method that we can use or will want to use. So if we want to override or use a different one, we just have to say, method, and then specify that we want to do a post. Of course, along with the post comes possibly data that we want to submit with that post. So we can go, I'm pretty sure it's body, we can double check in a sec. And this is where we might have like an object, or not an object, like some data, a string, or something in JSON that we would send along with this Ajax post. But yes, we do have to specify unless we're doing the default get, then we're kind of safe. Cool. So the first thing to kind of note when we're doing asynchronous requests is to think about the browser. And particularly one thing that is different from a normal HTTP request and an Ajax request is how our asynchronous request deals with history. So when we were back looking at Wikipedia, if I click from one page to this contact page, I can go back and visit this content. Right now, if I go from Pokemon 45 to like 23, I can't really go back. It's just, this application does not have track of the data that's coming up. And that's because all of our browsers track what sites we visited, when, and what the site was. They do that internal to themselves, and they do it by reloads of the browser and according to which URL is here. Because we're not doing that, by default, our asynchronous requests are not updating that browser history. So that, on face value, seems to be one maybe con of using this. The other thing that we're losing here is when I switch between pages, so when I go from this contact page over to help, I get an update to my URL. And this updated URL I can use to direct someone specifically to this page, right? Like if I give you this link and you go to it, it doesn't bring you to Wikipedia, the homepage or the general thing, and then you have to navigate to it. It brings you to that specific page. Right now with our application, we don't have, /24, /25 to go to a specific Pokemon. We lose our history, and we also kind of lose that URL tracking. That doesn't mean we can't do it. There is a history API that you can use with JavaScript, and with this history API, you can update the browser history as well as updating your URL manually. So you can get around it, but just by default, that's something you have to look out for. If you want to keep track of different content in a history style manner or link to it specifically, you are going to need to do that yourself. And that's with the history object. So if I just go here into the console of this page and I type in history, I see there's this big object that this is the API that is exposed to me. It has a length. It has scroll restoration. My guess is that if I'm here and I go back, it restores to the place in the page I was at. It also has a bunch of methods that we can do: back, forward, go, length, replace state, scroll, state. Particularly replace state and push state. These two would be helpful in updating your thing. But if I just go history.back, my page goes back. So we're not going to go really into that, but that's something you can play with and look around with. If you use the history API correctly, you'll have the full set of features that you would with like a normal set of HTTP requests. So not such a big roadblock, but something to think about nonetheless. The next thing, before we even look at like what are some of the use cases for using Ajax, what can we think of from our small demo? What were the benefits of this style of making this as opposed to if we had done like traditional HTTP requests? like, does this feel like a better way than doing it the other way? Maybe that's even a question we should ask before.
You'd have to redirect for pages every time if you did it the traditional way we were doing before.
Yeah, if we did it the way before, we'd have to redirect our pages every way. But maybe the feeling is like, it's Ajax stuff. Like, I'd rather just do it the old way. I mean, and that's a fine way of thinking. So if there's no like super apparent benefits, maybe we can look at both cons and benefits. So one thing, oh nice, using a lot less resources. And Caitlin's coming in. Oh, no. Yeah, so I'm not sure specifically what you mean, Lloyd, on using a lot less resources. But one way that it definitely does do that, but it does it in a few different ways. Oh yeah, I'll let you. I'll let them finish, but one way that we do have it using less resources is if I do a asynchronous request, I'm just requesting the data from an endpoint. If I wanted to update this page to go from 23 to 22, and I did it with a normal HTTP request, I'm going to the server, I'm running through the server, I'm hitting the route, and then I'm getting the data probably, and then I'm sending back the whole static page again. The HTML, the CSS, the image. It's a lot more work than just a single Ajax. Yeah, the API didn't require a lot of page redirecting or reloading, just received information. Exactly. Oh, another question, is Ajax what allows us to use promise instead of just callbacks? So promises, like, I'm not sure if you mean like on the backend and server, we've been doing HTTP requests back there, and if you've been using the request module, you would have to use callbacks with it. So that's just based on the module or the function that you're using, whether it supports promises or not. In terms of specifically HTTP requests on the front end, with a normal front end request, there is no callback even, because it just happens and the page is done, and then it gets delivered like a new set of things. With normal HTTP requests, it's kind of like you have like short-term memory. You use your pages as it is, and then it just gets wiped, and you start again with a new page. In this case, yeah, we can do promises now and callbacks because we are sending out the data and we're not resetting the page. We're waiting for it to be returned. In that sense, yeah, we do have promise. Or we could do callback support with asynchronous HTTP requests. That's like another option. Promises are a little bit cleaner way to go. I hope that kind of answered this question here. But another thing that, so apart from being more efficient in resources, doing Ajax also helps us to have this like single page application setup. So this word single page application, abbreviated to like SPA or SPA sometimes, means that our app is just one page, and as we navigate through it, we have different content being set up. So you saw that I clicked there and the URL updated to /funny. That's because they're using that history object. And to a lot of people, this single page feel of a page is just a benefit or an attractive feature in itself that I can toggle around, not have all of the things reload. The user doesn't get any apparent lag or wait time between moving through content, so that can be nice. There are a few other things too. Your front-loaded resources are also can be spread out throughout the page. So if I have a lot of content, and this you'll probably see as a pattern with something like Facebook or most, well, Reddit too, like something like the endless scrolling thing. As I go down, it just keeps loading. if I wanted to load in 1,000 posts and I did it with a traditional HTTP request, that's a lot of data to load at the start. With asynchronous requests, I can say just load 10, and then as the user hits the point where they need more, asynchronously load more data. So instead of having this really big wait at the start, we kind of get small waits dispersed throughout the application, which is way less noticeable to a user. Or in this case, we kind of can just go on forever and ever and ever. With a normal one, we would have to decide on a limit, and it would have to be reasonable so that the wait just wasn't huge for the user. There's other things that will become apparent as you go through it, but there also are a bunch of cons. And one of them is that accessibility with dynamic content is tricky. So what do I mean when I say accessibility? Has that word come up to you guys yet in web development? What is accessibility within web development? Yeah, exactly. So the comment here was, is it how accessible it is to people with like screen readers? That's like a really big part of it. But even broader behind that, it's the idea that if I make a website or web application, it should be usable and accessible by people of like any level of any level that they can use the page. So whether that be people who need screen readers or people who can't directly use the keyboard, different things like that are accessibility issues. And it becomes harder when we have dynamic content. A lot of screen readers aren't great at knowing when new content has been loaded and being able to relay that back to the user. It's also hard to convey the actions to reload new dynamic content. So there's things like that that can become a roadblock. They're not impossible to do, and it's getting better as people are becoming more conscious about accessibility, but that can be an issue. Asynchronous programming patterns in general are more complex to code. I'm sure that resonates with some of you guys. Callbacks and promises are not the easiest things as just handling something line by line, and you have to do a lot more of it, as we saw a little bit in our example here. This nested promise is a bit harder than maybe just a traditional HTTP request. We also require both JavaScript and XML HTTP request support. So this is the object that is used in the browser to accomplish this asynchronous request. Again, we're abstracted above it a little bit, but when we saw over here in our network tab, this XHR, that's the object itself, so it's requests using that object. And this is something that is not native JavaScript. It's something that has been added into browsers and therefore must be supported by a browser in order to work. And lastly, the last one we kind of already jumped over was that history is not automatically supported. It's something that we need to use. So if Ajax is dependent on both JavaScript and XML HTTP request object, then we can think of cases where if we don't have one of those or both of those, our site is not going to work. And this isn't necessarily a subtle thing, like back in, you didn't really use any JavaScript in TinyApp, really. But it's not a subtle thing in that some of these pages, we might have JavaScript support for doing little kind of like UI flourishes, like a drop-down menu or other things like that. That is nice to have, but probably not crucial. For a site like Reddit, if I don't support JavaScript or I don't have that HTTP request object, then I just can't use the site. Or I would think that I can't use the site. None of this stuff would load. If I switch between pages, it's not getting that asynchronous request, so just how can it show the new content? Which is why it can be important to think about fallbacks, and I'm sure Reddit has a fallback. It's the idea that if I can't do an asynchronous request, can I do a standard request to get the same content? Can I have the page load in a way that you can use it with or without this stuff? This is something that I'm sure there's like a lot of debate over. I'm making an asynchronous application. Should I support people who don't have JavaScript or don't have the XML HTTP request browser? Because nowadays, JavaScript is enabled by default throughout all browsers. So every browser has JavaScript support, and this XML HTTP request object has like universal support as well, apart from ancient browsers which are no longer supported by the browser themselves. And someone might have, if they put their computer away, I don't know how old some of these are, back in 2010, and just never touched that computer since then. So there's those edge cases. But the other cases, users just sometimes disable JavaScript. That's something you can do within like Chrome settings or any browser thing. It's probably not the best thing to do as a user, because you can think of all the ways that you would be restricted in how you interact with websites. But there are, use cases for doing it. If you have really slow internet, disabling JavaScript often helps with speed and bandwidth. Again, those like usability and accessibility issues, if you disable JavaScript, things being able to pop up and kind of dynamically change as you're interacting with the site, that's often easier for things like screen readers. This is not really why people would disable JavaScript. I should pop that one out of there. But also security. Like, security is a factor these days, and people who are cautious about what is running on their computer, and somewhat rightfully so. So I'm sure most of us think that JavaScript is pretty safe, for the main reason that it runs in the browser for that page. Like, I can't write a JavaScript script that will then go off and live in my computer after I visit this web page. But even just having access to the web page and running dynamic content here, there are like vulnerability risks. Like, two examples I can think of, people have done they'll dynamically put forms on the page, and they'll call the form, if I have a form with a name password or a form with a name email, like right now, when I go to type something, you see all these suggestions. And these suggestions are because, well, I've typed a bunch of things into this form, but it's looking through my history and seeing 4 forms named, what did I name this? Search. Here are similar things that you put in. So people have run JavaScript scripts where they hide forms and they switch the name between like email, password, a bunch of other things. Of course, password ones don't give you suggested things, but they can find, based on your suggested list for that, what content you have, email things. Other stuff people have done is people will insert like hidden links on the page dynamically and run through like hundreds of different links. And based on the link status, whether it's blue or purple, they'll know that you've either been to that site or haven't been to that site before. I guess the point is people are tricky, and they're always finding ways to get your data. So people don't like that, and they disable JavaScript. Yeah, so it's not a simple decision on whether to have a fallback or not. In your guys' cases, in the projects that you're doing, in your midterms and finals, it's not something you're going to be focusing on. It's not something that you're going to demo. It's not something that you have to care about in this case. But in the broader context of web development, as you go on in your careers and work for other companies, it might be something that comes up. And you might be tasked like, hey, we have the site that does everything asynchronously. We want you to make it support no JavaScript. So lastly, I guess second from last, the Ajax that we used, the response was in the form of JSON. We were just getting raw data from our API, but it's not the only thing that asynchronous requests can return. The reason it's called Ajax, asynchronous JavaScript, and XML is because when it was first started to be used, the primary thing it returned was XML. And XML, let's just look it up, for a while was like the favored way of passing data in web development. broadly, it's information that looks like this. It's enclosed in tags. You can do data similar to in a similar way that you can use JSON for this. But if you look at this, it also looks similar to HTML. So there's a form of HTML called XHTML that complies by all of the XML standards that you can deliver and serve with XML. So you can have an Ajax request that then returns like HTML to be rendered. As an example, you go in here. With GitHub, if I make a new project, call this so I have an Ajax project is like a newer feature of theirs so that I can add kind of like a working like Trello board or post board for like ongoing issues and things that I'm working on for a repository. But if I open up the network tab here, and we look at XHR, which is our Ajax stuff. We got nothing right now. If I go to add a column, we'll just call this test, and I create that column. We get this new piece of UI in there, and if we look through these are all the asynchronous requests that it made, so a whole bunch of them. We look at the response here. The response from columns is HTML markup. It says project column, a details section. We have the edit column, manage, all this different stuff. And that's what makes up this box here. I'm sure if I do this, yeah, we see the edit column, manage, automation, archive. And then if I look in the in the HTML, and I grab just this column, it looks it looks the same as that HTML that was returned. So that's another option. We're not restricted to just receiving JSON from these Ajax requests. The pattern that some people like to go is to actually return like kind of mini templates for new data that can be just inserted into the page as HTML. The method that you're going to go with Tweeter is instead to just get the data from the server and then build the HTML client side. So you're going to make a new tweet, and the tweet's going to look like this. It'll have a div, it'll have this, and then you'll insert the data from the server. Then finally, you'll append it onto to the list of tweets. But alternate ways of doing it. Lastly, actually, any questions on Ajax at this stage? Cool. The last thing that you might encounter now that we can do asynchronous requests is something called CORS. I'm not going to go too much into detail into this, but I'll include a link that you can read more on it. CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. But in general, first, let's think about what is a cross-origin request. So a cross-origin request is an HTTP request to a server that did not serve the original web page. Meaning if we have like web server A, which is called origin here, and this is what we initially use to get the first rendered content of our page. When I go to wikipedia.org, I'm making a GET request. When I hit enter in this browser, it's going to a server, and it's returning me all the HTML, CSS, whatever it needs to render this page. So that's the origin server. That's a server that delivers us everything. If I then decide from the client to make a request to a server that is not this origin, that is called a cross-origin request. I am no longer communicating with the main server that delivers me all my content. I'm deciding to communicate with another server somewhere else. So our example using the Pokey API was a cross-origin request. our origin server was this lightweight, that HTTP server that I started in the beginning. That's our origin server. And then the cross-origin request was to another server called Pokey API. The reason we have to think about this is because this CORS thing is a set of principles around guarding or guarding how those cross-origin requests can be made. So by default, a lot of servers do not support cross-origin requests. I didn't do anything weird in our example setting up our communication to that API endpoint, and that's because the Pokey API just supports cross-origin requests by default. But you can get errors. I mean, I can kind of trivially create one just by messing up the path here. So Pokemon API v2/Pokemon is an endpoint on their server which supports cross-origin resource sharing. If I kind of mess with the endpoint and just add too many slashes, now that's not a real endpoint. And if I refresh here, our thing breaks. And if I look at the network, I have this one request at 12. It failed. It's not letting me scroll. It fails, and oh, here, we even get a console log. So it says access to XML HTTP request. So this is our our Ajax request to this endpoint from origin. It says has been blocked by CORS policy, no access control, allow origin. So if you see this, that's your problem. It's because you're trying to make a cross-origin request to some server that doesn't support, well, either A, doesn't support that cross-origin request, or requires you to authenticate yourself more. So CORS is the enforced standards to restrict or allow cross-origin requests. And the main way that it enforces these requests or communicates whether you're allowed to do it or not is just through header information. So in some cases, when you get this error, you can set a specified set of headers, and then it'll allow you to do it. One of them being this often works, but you can look around and see where it is. Often, like this idea of doing requests directly from the client to another server is not the best design strategy. The alternate way would be that as a client, I make a asynchronous or HTTP request to the origin, and then the origin requests the information from that alternate server. So that's kind of the main way you would do things. But if you have to make requests from your client, just watch out for this type of thing. Cool. Kind of at the end there, just a long draw through this stuff. I hope it was still helpful though. Any questions from this? Yep.
So the cross-origin request, that's just when they're going to like a different web page. So like in your file, like you have like your path defined. Yeah. So like would you just make a second path to a different web page? Is that what cross-origin means?
So the question was, is cross-origin resource sharing like when I just have a path like this? If I'm trying to access this and another API, is that like now I'm cross-origin? Not exactly. Cross-origin means like there's a specific host origin, and that path, often in our case is localhost colon 80 or 3000 or whatever we're on. That's the origin where all of this content is coming from. It's serving all of our stuff. So cross-origin means instead of this, I'm making a request in this case to this. I don't need a second one of these. Like I don't need Wikipedia. It just needs to be differentiating from this or this. Or if I owned Wikipedia, it would be maybe my origin server would be, Wikipedia, and then my cross-origin one would be this guy. But in our cases, we can think of the origin as localhost. you shouldn't be like you won't be running into this for some time. I see people sometimes hit course problems in like their final projects and stuff, but it's at this point we're just trying to get like an understanding that, oh, it's an issue out there that can happen because of this behavior. We shouldn't have to be like troubleshooting it too much. Cool. We have like 2 minutes. I think let's just run through one more feature on our guy here. What I kind of wanted to do was have it so if we put in a number, oh, I broke the thing. I gotta fix it first. I wanted to have it so that it's, you know, like who's that Pokemon? I wanted to have it so that if we put in a number, like I don't know what 12 is, and I don't want it to like tell me. Oh, who's this guy? Wow. I don't want it to tell me who it is. I want it to just like have a fuzzed out picture, and only if I put in someone's actual name does it like show me the actual information. So we can accomplish the fuzziness with a filter. So if I go to here, I say, okay, class Pokédex plus unidentified. So by default, it's unidentified, and when we have the class Pokédex, and it's also unidentified, the image in there, we want to apply a filter, and I'm going to set the brightness to 0%. So there you go. So when I refresh, oh, because wait, that's not cool. We get rid of this. Oh, there you go. Yeah, but then we don't get our cool background. But now it's all like blurred out because it's a PNG. So we can do a test in here where maybe we can do if, we'll check if the search is not a number. So if the search is not a number, we probably want to add that class, else we'll remove the class. So we'll grab Pokédex and what do I call it? Unidentified. Otherwise, we're going to do the opposite, and we're going to remove the class. So hopefully, initially we get that. Ooh. Oh, this is in the wrong spot. So we'll do this before the request even happens up here. So get that, and then we'll do, nope. No. Yeah, it looks like it. But I don't know if that's the only error with our thing. Okay, maybe. So if we go, 24, we just get the, oh, but it tells us the name. Well, we can change that. And then if we go Arbok, it's Arbok. Okay, let's quickly fix that too. Oh, that ruins it kind of. I have to do, this is not the best way to do it, but I'll just do it for quickness sake. Nice. Who's that? Pokemon. Ah! Oh no! It showed for a sec. Okay. Cool. Well, that's everything. Kind of I had to look at. I'll share these notes with you guys. I'll also be around, so if you have any further questions, either here in Vancouver or Victoria, you guys have any further questions, just hit me up on Slack. And yeah, thanks guys.